For our first topic, I wanted to talk about the growing anti-Semitism in response to the Israel-Hamas war, which is unfortunately a global trend at the moment. And while I think a lot of us have been shocked by what we've seen on U.S. college campuses and in protests in major cities, perhaps more surprising is this trend in China, a country without a historical experience of anti-Semitism. So in the immediate aftermath of October 7th, we saw a family member of an Israeli diplomat in China stabbed in Beijing. And now we're seeing an uproar of anti-Semitic comments across social media in China. And it's worth noting that, from my perspective at least, these statements being made are bold and conspicuous, lacking sort of the usual cleverness of Chinese citizens on social media, which seems to suggest that the censors and thus the party are not interested in containing these messages. Miles, can you give us an overview of what we're seeing here and your initial reaction to it?
I think, there's a spontaneous bias and prejudice. There is also state-sponsored manipulation of bias and prejudice. In the Chinese case, it was definitely the anti-Semitism is surging. It has a lot to do with the government manipulation of information and censorship. I'll give you one example. The most popular video and movie sharing giant in China is a website called Bilibili.com. Also commonly known as a B-side. It's basically, China's version of YouTube and even bigger. There is a movie, Schindler's List, that has been consistently ranked very high because it's a good movie. So the ranking was a 9.7 before the Hamas atrocities on Israel. Immediately after that, there's a lot of people went to that site and give 1 star and write nasty comments. And that Schindler's List rating dropped dramatically within a few days, from 9.7 to 4.3 in the aftermath of the Hamas genocide. Now, don't get me wrong, there are a lot of people in China who were sympathetic to the Israelis' plight. They were condemning Hamas, but they were not allowed to strive. Their comments were censored severely. So this is basically a state-sponsored anti-Semitism. It is the expression of the state policy on part of the Chinese government.
I want to ask, China is not Europe. It does not have a long history of anti-Semitism, and there are very few Jews living there today. So, where does this come from? My understanding is we saw maybe an initial intensification of this trend as early as 2020. Is this an accurate assessment, or does the trend go back further? Can you talk a bit about where these ideas are coming from in China?
It goes very, very deep, and it has a lot to do with the Chinese communist ideology. China's guiding principle is Marxism-Leninism. Marxism is deeply anti-Semitic. If you read the Marxist classics, you basically find 2 things that is really germane on this topic. One is Marxism is profoundly anti-wealth, anti-capital, anti-money. Number 2, Marxism-Leninism is basically fueled by conspiracy. It's very easy to create and propagandizing conspiracy in China. So China is a fertile ground for anti-wealth and for conspiracy. If you combine these 2, and then you find this deep ideological root of anti-Semitism, because the Chinese government has been finding this mythology, the myth that Jewish people are overwhelmingly wealthy. With that wealth, that they have a secret plan to control international financial institutions and foreign governments. This is basically what the Chinese populace has been indoctrinated with. The number 1 anti-West blogger in China is a gentleman by the name of Sima Nan. Now, Sima Nan has said that during World War II, the Japanese and Jews conspired to establish a Jewish state in China. And this is just crazy. Many people bought that theory. Now, who is the most prominent Jews in the world? Well, who are the most prominent Jews in the world? Well, one of them is George Soros. Now, George Soros has the habit of shorting Chinese economy. He believes the Chinese economy is ultimately untenable. He believes that Chinese technology is very dangerous to control free flow of information. So the Chinese government tied George Soros with the conspiracy theory, tied him with the Hong Kong protests in 2019 and 2020, particularly to tie George Soros with Jimmy Lai, who is a Catholic, who is now in jail, and other Hong Kong protesters. So this is very, very deep. Now, I would even go deeper. Communist ideology, particularly Marxism, is ideologically biased against Jews. Karl Marx himself was a Jewish person, but he's like a character out of a Woody Allen movie. He's a self-hating Jew. Karl Marx's anti-Semitism was deep and rampant. Marx's first major political article, which he published in 1844, is one entitled On the Jewish Questions. In that article, Karl Marx endorsed the German socialist theorist Bruno Bauer's rampant anti-Semitism. Now, Bauer believed that to eliminate the so-called Jewish problem, you have to eliminate the Jewish religion, the Judaism. Marx agreed with Bauer's diagnosis of the so-called Jewish problem, but disagreed with Bauer on Judaism, the religion, being the source of the Jewish problem, as Marx termed it. Marx believed that Jews had no real religion. Jewish religion was money, according to Karl Marx. Therefore, Karl Marx believed that, I quote, in that article of 1844, money is the jealous God of Israel, beside which no other God may exist. And Karl Marx continued, the God of the Jew has been secularized and has become the God of the world. End of quote. That's Karl Marx. And then Karl Marx then concluded in that article, I quote, in emancipating itself from hucksterism and money, and thus from real and practical Judaism, our age would emancipate itself. End of quote. That's from Karl Marx. Now, I would also even go even further. Karl Marx's anti-Semitism is deeply intertwined with his unwavering racism. This kind of combination of racism and anti-Semitism in Karl Marx is further revealed in his other writings, particularly his letter to his comrade Friedrich Engels. In 1862, Karl Marx had a feud with the fellow Prussian-German socialist philosopher Ferdinand Lassalle. Here's what Marx wrote to Engels on July 30th, 1862, about Lassalle. And I quote, it is now perfectly clear to me, as the shape of his head and the growth of his hair indicates, he is descended from the Negroes who joined in Moses' flight from Egypt. This union of Jew and German on a Negro base was bound to produce an extraordinary hybrid. End of quote. That is from Karl Marx himself to Friedrich Engels, July 30th, 1862. So this kind of a deeply racist and an anti-Semitic combination is rooted in communist Marxist ideology, money and conspiracy. Those are the two pillars of Marxism.
So, I mean, as you've painted here, we have a situation in which obviously any people is going to have a diversity of ideas throughout the population, but there is some anti-Semitism embedded in the people downstream from the party, which is sort of at its core, has a deep skepticism and conspiratorial view towards the Jewish people in line with Karl Marx. Do you perceive Israel as being aware of this in their interactions with China? And I guess the broader question is just, with this being the case and this sort of coming to the forefront now, maybe in a way that it hasn't been in the last few years, what effect do you think this is going to have on China's relationship with Israel and, as a consequence, its attempts to frame itself as an impartial peacemaker in the Middle East?
Israeli government has protested the Chinese government several times. Every time the Chinese central TV station presenters would say that the Jews control the global institutions of finance, and the Israeli government sent a protest. But that protest has become routine and it becomes sort of a prosaic. There is no real power. I think the fact is that much of the world still harbors the illusion that China could be an honest broker for peace and for coexistence of different people on the face of the earth. China is an opportunist country. And I might also say what I just said earlier about the Marxist ideological roots of anti-Semitism in communist China is also combined this meddling materialistic culture in China. Because China basically right now, everybody wants to get rich, get wealthy. That's one of the few things they could do, because when they get rich and then realize, there's a problem with the Communist Party. I mean, so they get rich and get out of China. But nevertheless, a lot of Chinese business-oriented people harbor deep resentment and jealousy toward what they consider a Jewish domination in global commerce. This is based upon fantasy and based upon bias. And much of anti-Semitism generates from this, particularly in China.
Our next topic is a bit lighter, and that is what appears to be the end of panda diplomacy. With Beijing's relationship with the West souring, none of the agreements they have with countries like the United States, Britain, and Australia have been renewed to keep leasing these pandas to foreign zoos. And so the pandas at the National Zoo in Washington are set to return November 15th, which will leave us only with an exhibit in Atlanta, with that agreement set to expire next year. Miles, could you give us a bit of a background on this, especially for those who may be unfamiliar? What is panda diplomacy, and why does U.S.-China relations affect our capacity to see pandas at the zoo?
Well, panda diplomacy started with Nixon's visit to China in 1972. So Patrick Nixon, the first lady, at the dinner table, and look at the panda themed is a cup, a teacup or something. And she said, oh, this is lovely. And the Chinese leadership took note of that. Oh, how about I send you some panda? So that's basically became the panda mania. You talk about the upbringing. Personally, I'm not predisposed to like panda, because I grew up in a panda-infested Sichuan province. Even though my particular locale was not like really panda-infested, but nearby regions, they're all full of pandas. So, I mean, people really didn't like panda, because you have to understand, panda is a bear. It's a wild animal. It's a very surly, very aggressive. It's like solitude, doesn't want to be bothered. So, evolutionarily speaking, panda shouldn't even exist, because it has a tremendous problem reproducing itself. So I guess personal affection for animals can be very relative. I'll give you one example. Carp in the United States is considered trash fish, bottom feeders. Very few people want to eat it. But in Asia, particularly in China and Japan, carp is a symbol of good luck, fortune, fertility, and success. It's a perpetual motif in holiday paintings or wedding ceremonies. So, I mean, this is all relative. I want to also speak about the image of panda, which actually is very interesting, because the image of panda has been transformed over the years greatly, from the loving, adorable goofballs to now the nasty and schemy kung fu panda, right? So it's had real teeth, and it coincides with the image of China over the decades. Reality always catches up with fantasy, very much like the 18th century European fantasy about the philosopher's king ruling a great empire. There's a chinoiserie in the 18th century. That sort of fantasy and chinoiserie clashed with the brutal reality of the 19th century Europeans' understanding of China being a very backward, brutal, and uncivilized civilization. But also, I was just thinking about this on the way to the recording studio. There's also a jurisprudence question. Why should China have a monopoly of total ownership of pandas? Why should the pandas be only kept inside China? Even panda cubs born outside of China in foreign zoos, and those pandas were along by those foreign zoos with the exorbitant amount of money each year. I think it has something to do with China's monopoly about a lot of things. China not want to share. It wants to make profit. It wants to own everything. I mean, there's a lot of animals endemic to America. American alligators, Sonoma chipmunks, Hawaiian hawks, Baltimore Orioles. I mean, are we not allowed to export some of those animals endemic to America to foreign zoos? Of course, it has been the case. So I'm thinking about the panda returning to China. It has some really, really deep philosophical musings that every country must do.
That's very interesting. On the practical side of things, I mean, do you see this being a legitimate concern of either the Biden administration or U.S. policy going forward? I mean, it seems to go along the lines of an argument you've made many times here, that is, a fundamental mistake we make is to focus on these transactional issues, which are then used by the party as leverage so that we ignore the broader fundamental tensions. And I mean, this is a perfect example of a very narrow, specific transactional issue. Do you see this as something that might be reconciled going forward?
I don't want to really elevate panda diplomacy to higher level than it deserves. I mean, panda diplomacy is long gone. It symbolizes Americans' naivete. I mean, so it's actually a pretty painful and embarrassing memory, in my view, just like many other China policies in the past. So we're going through a great awakening, the reevaluating of American China policy. That has been done. So panda goes to China. My view is good riddance.
All right. Well, turning to the economic side of U.S.-China relations for our last topic, the Vanguard Group, one of the largest U.S.-based funds, is exiting China, dismantling its last team there and shutting its main office in Shanghai. Concurrently, Gallup, the U.S.-based consultancy giant, is also pulling out of China, canceling a number of projects and moving the rest outside the country. So, Miles, we're seeing two established giants in the private sector cut ties, a dramatic shift from the ambitious enthusiasm and expansion into Chinese markets we saw just a few years ago. How significant is this as an indicator of the future of U.S.-China relations? What is your reaction? How should we think about this?
Well, this is a reality, right? Secretary of Commerce Gina Raimondo went to China a couple of months ago, leaving one memorable word to the world. That is, she said China is basically uninvestable. Uninvestable. This is precisely the reason why. Vanguard is one of the largest U.S. wealth management firms. It handles trillions of yuan. It had some joint projects with some of China's largest counterparts, including the Ant Group that's formerly run by Jack Ma. Since Jack Ma was busted, so that joint venture also went busted. Gallup had been in China since 1993, 3 decades ago. Gallup is in the due diligence consultancy business. In other words, Gallup business is finding out truth and reality. Truth and reality are what the CCP hates. Virtually all U.S. and major European and Japanese due diligence firms are being chased out right now. PRC also itself has cut off economic data sharing completely with the foreign companies, making China even more uninvestable. What's remaining in China are a few big companies. For the U.S., for example, you got Kentucky Fried Chicken, you got Tesla, you got General Motors and Walmart. But their profit margin has shrunk dramatically in the last several years too. So I don't see a bright future for these even big ones who want to stick around in China. What we have here is China's fake and dishonest due diligence firms that produce fake data and biased political information. I'll give you one example. Harvard University, that has received about $80 million from China. In the Kennedy School of Government, there is an Ash Center. Ash Center also has done a multi-year long survey of public opinion inside China. But they actually weren't allowed to do so because foreign polling agencies in China were very, very frowned upon. So you cannot do it. So Harvard University subcontract a Beijing-based Chinese polling firm called Horizon Research Consultancy Group. That Chinese consulting group did the survey on behalf of Harvard, but the result was published in the name of Harvard University. What's the result? The result said that a multi-year survey in China has indicated that 93% of Chinese people are happy with the Chinese Communist Party. That's the message Chinese government is looking for. That's the message Chinese government has been sending to the rest of the world repeatedly through its foreign ministry spokespersons. Well, one would wonder the fidelity of that polling, right? Because in China, even to ask the very question whether you like or dislike the Chinese Communist Party runs great risk. So let alone give you an honest opinion. This whole polling inside China by the Chinese firm to be published by the reputable institution outside of China is total farce. One would also ask, what happened to the 7% people who said they didn't like the Chinese Communist Party? Maybe they're all in jail. So this is why finding out China's reality is a very important mounting task. Don't believe in the essence of a Chinese state statistics, what the Chinese government wants you to hear. China is a completely controlled information environment. That's the lesson the rest of the world should learn.